There was a neighborhood on the Lower East Side where you could hear German before you heard English. Not a few families tucked into a corner building. Not a small ethnic club that met on Sundays. An entire world. Gone now. Scrubbed from the way New York tells its own story. Most people born up through the East Village or Tompkins Square Park with a coffee in your hand. You have already stood where it used to be. You just did not know it. At its peak in the 1870s and 1880s, roughly 400,000 German Americans lived in New York City. A huge share of them were packed into one stretch of Manhattan, from the East River West Street down toward Canal. It was not a side note in immigrant history. It was the largest German-speaking community outside of Berlin. Read that again. Outside of Berlin. They did not come to hide. They came to build. Breweries, bakeries, butcher shops, printing presses, mutual aid societies that functioned like insurance before insurance existed for working people. German-language newspapers sold on street corners. Churches where the sermons, the hymns, the service, all of it in German. Avenue B did not feel like a neighborhood that happened to have German residents. It felt like a piece of Europe that someone had lifted off the map and dropped onto New York. Walk it in your mind for a second. Wooden signs you cannot read unless you grew up with the umlaut. Beer gardens where men argued politics over lager after a 10-hour shift. Women in doorways shaking rugs into alleys that already smelled like smoke and yeast and river damp. Kids running between pushcarts. The East River close enough that you could hear boats even when you could not see them. This was not nostalgia invented later. This was daily life at industrial scale. And it worked. Within a generation, German New Yorkers owned businesses, ran presses, served on school boards, built institutions that outlasted individual lifetimes. They were not waiting to become American. They were building a German America inside America, confident, loud, organized, and deeply rooted in one place. Then the city changed the rules without announcing it. New York has always been good at welcoming the world, decades. But mighty neighborhoods in New York are still fragile. One fire, one war, one shift in who has money and who has memory. That is often all it takes. June 15th, 1904. Write that date down. The General Slocum steamship caught fire on the East River. More than 1,000 people died. Most of them were women and children from Kleindeutschland, on a church picnic. Mothers, grandmothers, kids in their Sunday clothes. It was one of the deadliest disasters in New York history, and it hit one community with the precision of a wound that never fully closes. Imagine that scale of grief inside 12 blocks. Not abstract history. Real doors where someone did not come home. Real pews where whole families disappeared in a single afternoon. Real shops where the owner's name was spoken less and less because speaking it hurt too much. A neighborhood can survive poverty. It can survive prejudice. It is much harder to survive the feeling that the city itself has swallowed your children. The disaster did not erase Kleindeutschland overnight. That is not how erasure works in New York. Erasure is slower, more polite, more deniable. Families moved away to escape the memory. Younger generations stopped speaking German in public because grief and pride do not always survive in silence. Same voice. Businesses changed hands. Street life thinned. The world that had felt permanent started to feel temporary in retrospect. Then came World War I, and with it, a different kind of fire, suspicion. German culture in America did not disappear because people suddenly disliked pretzels. It disappeared because war turns language into evidence. Street names were changed. German schools faced pressure. Newspapers folded or switched tongues. Being German in New York became dangerous in a way it had not been when Kleindeutschland was rising. By the 1920s, Little Germany was mostly a memory carried by older people and buried in archives most New Yorkers never opened. That made it a world had already left. What replaced it was a faster city, a louder city, a city less patient with old accents and old grief. New groups moved in. New languages filled the stairwells. New stories got written on top of the old ones. That is not automatically evil. That is New York. But it is also how entire civilizations inside one zip code can vanish. Demolition notice. Today you can walk those blocks and feel almost nothing. Tompkins Square Park on a warm afternoon, Avenue A at rush hour, St. Mark's Place at night, students, cafes, rents that would have stunned a 19th century brewer into silence. The city keeps moving because that is what cities do. It rarely asks you to mourn what used to echo off the same walls. There are traces if you know where to look. A church facade that outlasted the congregation. An old meeting hall repurposed into something else. A plaque you might walk past without reading because plaques do not shout. New York is full of quiet evidence. The problem is not that the evidence vanished. The problem is that the city trained us not to expect it. Kleindeutschland did not fail. It did not collapse because German immigrants were lazy or unwelcome or incapable of building a future. It was broken by disaster, by war, by time, and by a city that builds on top of its own layers without teaching its residents what lived there first. That is the pattern. Little Germany, little Syria, other little worlds with names you were never taught to see. And once you see the pattern, you cannot unsee it. Every vanished neighborhood is not just a sad story. It is a warning about how memory works in a city built for speed. Who gets remembered? Who gets a monument? Who gets reduced to one sentence in a guidebook if they are lucky? So the next time you walk the Lower East Side, listen. Not for German. Not for 19 looks like now, and what it had to destroy or outlive to look that way. Because New York did not just grow, it replaced, again and again. And the neighborhoods that lose are not always the ones that lacked ambition. Sometimes they are the ones that built too much, too well, too quietly, in a language the city eventually stopped bothering to learn. That is the real lost history. Not only what disappeared, but how easily we are taught to call disappearance progress without ever learning the